Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'd like to talk to you about some work that I've been doing with a postdoc, Jake Soloff, my colleague Rena Barber, and student Melissa Adrian on trying to perform stable model selection, especially in the context of biological systems. So one example of this problem is equation discovery, and there's a number of people within the Institute that are thinking about this. And what I mean by it is taking observations or data, and from that, trying to estimate a system of governing equations. And the hope is that by doing that, we will understand something about the underlying physical laws. So, for instance, we have a number of different people within NITMB who are studying the dynamics of microbial communities. And several of these people are here today, both faculty and trainees. And the idea would be something like the following. So we've got a community of, say, bacteria or other microbes surviving together within a community. And what we observe over time is the abundance of each species. And what we'd like to be able to understand is how those species are interacting. When one is increased, does it cause others to decrease or also increase? Or what other kinds of relationships are within this system? So for instance, what we could do is we could denote the abundance of species K at time t as U superscript K of t. And what we'd like to be able to do within this context of equation discovery is to find a function f of k, or f sub k, that writes down the derivative of this abundance of the kth species over time as a function of the abundances of all the species in the community. Another example being examined within NITMB is trying to understand and learn biophysical models of cell development and function. So for instance, this group of faculty and trainees are looking at, for instance, from microscopy data, trying to learn equations that describe the development of different cells or circadian rhythms or other types of behaviors. So ultimately, when we think about this problem of equation discovery, it's an example of a broader class of problems called model selection, where really what we want to do is to find a model that's a good fit to the data. So there's lots of examples of model selection within biology. We just heard Eric talking about trying to find graphical models that describe gene regulatory networks, for instance. Or we have people who are looking to find agent-based models of a biological system, trying to estimate the order of an autoregressive dynamical model, selecting the number of clusters in a data set. And throughout various NITMB seminars and meetings, we've just heard a whole host of different model selection problems that arise in different biological contexts. So let's return to the problem of equation discovery. And just to be really concrete, let's look at a problem that has origins perhaps closer to physics, where here we've got two different particles that are evolving over time according to this system of differential equations on the right. So this is the Lorenz 63 ODE system. And so it's a chaotic system. Those two particles started very close together, but as time goes on, their positions can be very far apart from one another. And when I talk about equation discovery, I think, okay, imagine that we don't know that generating system of differential equations. And what we want to do is to take observations of the locations of these particles at every point in time, and from that, estimate what those differential equations are. So one very popular approach to performing this task is the SINDI method, or sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics. So this is from a paper that's almost a decade old, and they said we can actually treat this equation discovery problem as a sparse regression problem. So for instance, we could say let's just focus on the x coordinate of the particles, and we can write down the dx dt as being a weighted sum of different polynomial terms of the locations of the particles. So we've got x, y, z, x squared, xz, y squared, etc. And so then what we want to do is, given the observations of the locations of the particles at each point in time, we have samples of dx dt and all of the different terms in this expression, and we can estimate the weights or the coefficients, the psi's. And in this example, only 2 of them are non-zero. It's a very sparse system, and so we can estimate them from the data, and we can do the same for the y-coordinates and the z-coordinates. So this is an exciting technology. People use it in a variety of different contexts, but there's a key challenge that is prevalent in biological settings. Specifically, we can often have many models or many different equations that could all fit the data very well. And so if we make slight changes to the data that we've collected, then we could end up selecting an entirely different model, right? Just a small perturbation in the data could result in us choosing a different equation, having a different understanding of the governing laws. And so in the context of scientific discovery, that's a major problem. So let me give you an illustration of why this might occur. This is a very general phenomenon, but I just want to explain that in the context of this Cindy algorithm that I just described. So I said that we set it up as a sparse regression problem. Excuse me. As a sparse regression problem. So on the left, we've got the derivative du dt for species k. And then in this big matrix here, U, we have all the species abundances in the different columns, and each row is a different point in time. And then we've got a vector of weights, psi, that we're trying to estimate. So we can use methods like the lasso or other forms of sparse regression to try to estimate psi. But if we've got columns in this matrix, say these 2 columns here, that are very highly correlated, then what sparse regression tries to do is it tries to choose only one of them, only one of those terms to show up in our estimate of the governing equation. And it can be just extremely sensitive to noise, and it can be extremely sensitive to the data. So if I were to just leave out one row in this matrix, I might choose one column, and if I keep that row, I might choose a different column. So this is how this instability that I mentioned can manifest itself. So what I want to describe today are tools that we can use to stabilize this model selection problem while making minimal assumptions. So I don't want to have to assume that somebody's using a very specific form of sparse regression. I don't want to have to assume that all my data is IID, because these are extremely strong assumptions in a variety of contexts. So I just want to be as assumption-free as I possibly can, and yet still ensure that our model selection is stable. Okay, so before really tackling stability in the model selection context, I want to consider a simpler problem of just plain old regression. And in particular, let's imagine this setup. We're given a training data set, script D, which is a collection of XY pairs, and our goal is to figure out a mapping from a new X to a label Y. So given a test point, little x, we want to predict the corresponding y. And now we're going to assume that y is just a scalar. So later on, we'll come back to the model selection problem. This is just a simpler instantiation. So we think about this issue as having a learning algorithm A that is going to accept our training data set and then output a predictor f hat. So just to be concrete, as an example, the algorithm A could correspond to the entire process of, say, training a neural network on the training data, using weight decay and the atom optimizer, and the whole process all together. And then f hat is the resulting trained model, the thing that we actually use to make predictions on new samples. And so now what we'd like to do is to figure out how this A can be stabilized, or how we can make sure that A is stable. So informally, we say that an algorithm is stable if the resulting predictor f hat is very close to the predictor we would have gotten if we had applied the same algorithm to the training data with everything except the ith sample. So if we had just left out the ith sample and done the same process, hopefully the predictor won't change too much. And if so, then we would say it's stable. So here's an example of instability, where if I used all the training data and tried to learn a classifier, I would get one decision boundary between the red and the blue classes. And if I were to remove this sample right here and repeat my process, I get a very different looking decision boundary. So this is the thing that we want to guard against. And I'm just going to move this before I hurt myself. Okay, so why do we care about stability? I already mentioned in the context of model selection, we care about it because it aids with scientific discovery. But it's also important for a variety of other reasons. So in this regression setting, for instance, the core insight is that if we have a model that's stable in this leave one out setting, if we remove a training sample, our model doesn't change too much, then what that suggests is that the leave one out errors, measurements of the errors we would get if we train on all but the ith sample and then see how well we perform on the ith sample, those are representative of the test errors. So what that means is that if we've trained a model that's leave one out stable like this, then we can get a good sense of how well we should be able to do on future test points. So a little bit more specifically, it's useful for ensuring we have good generalization performance, that we're going to perform well on good test data. And in fact, there's papers dating all the way back a couple of decades showing that when we have a stable algorithm, it's sufficient to ensure that a method generalizes well. It also is important to ensure that cross-validation is efficient, and it helps us characterize when risk can be driven to zero. In addition, there's been a lot of work recently on trying to not only make point predictions, like predict what y is going to be for a new test sample x, but also to get prediction intervals, right? So instead of just saying, I predict there will be 1.3 inches of rain today, I might like to say, I predict there will be somewhere between 0.9 and 1.8 inches of rain. I'd like to have that interval, and I'd like the true amount of rain to lie within that interval with high probability. In order to do this with minimal assumptions, it's necessary for us to have stable algorithms. Okay, so how do we get stable algorithms? And in part this is challenging because a lot of times the learning methods that we want to use are very complex and very hard to characterize, right? Like just here's one example of a classifier of digits using a CNN. And so there's convolutional neural network layers, there's max pooling, there's fully connected layers, there's all kinds of things going on here. And so taking these really large and complex models and showing that each individual model separately is guaranteeing stability is an extremely hard problem. So then you might say, well, could I just certify stability, right? Once I have a model, can I just somehow probe it with a bunch of test data and ensure that it's a stable method? And the answer is no. We can prove that it is impossible to certify stability without knowing a lot of details about the algorithm, unless you just have an extremely large data set and an extremely high computational budget, like prohibitively large. Okay, so what's left to do? We're going to turn to an idea that dates back to the 90s from Leo Bremen, who said, given that instability has undesirable consequences, what can be done? And the answer is unstable procedures can be stabilized. So the core tool, or workhorse here, is something called bagging. And the idea is the following. We're going to let S sub b correspond to a subset of the total number of training samples. So we've got n training samples, and we're going to choose m of them, and we're going to have that be a bag. And then we're going to apply our learning algorithm to each bag separately, and then we're going to average the resulting predictors. Right? So graphically, right, each of these colored dots is a different training sample, and then I choose a different set of training samples. They form my different bags. I apply my learning algorithm to each bag separately and get a different predictor. And then my ensemble model is just the average of all of those different predictors. Okay, so just to set up a little bit of notation here, when I talk about some of our theoretical results, I'm going to refer to a quantity P, which is basically the probability of an individual sample I showing up in one of these bags. And that P can be different depending on whether we are sampling with replacement or without replacement. But in both cases, the probability depends on the total number of training samples that we're sampling from, and then the number of samples in each bag. All right. So empirically, there's plenty of evidence that bagging provides stability. So for instance, in each of these plots, I'm looking at a different machine learning algorithm, and I'm looking at it both with and without bagging. And what I'm showing are histograms of the leave one out perturbations. So I'm looking at the prediction on some new test point versus the prediction I would get on that test point if I had left out the ith sample. And remember, for a stable method, I want this difference to be very small. So I want these histograms to really have a lot of mass over here on the left. And in blue, that's what we see across the board, whereas in red, where we don't use bagging, we see that those leave one out perturbations can be quite large. So there's plenty of evidence for instability without the bagging. And in general, people have used bagging in a heuristic way to, as a heuristic for ensuring stability in a variety of different contexts: random forest, variable selection and regression, Bayes bag, and in a number of other settings. So the question is, what can we say theoretically? What kind of guarantees do we have? So some of the past theory has examined bagging from a variety of different perspectives. They've said that it reduces variance of estimators. This is a nice result, but it is asymptotic, so it's thinking about what happens is we have an infinite amount of data, and it makes very strong regularity assumptions that generally just aren't true in biological context. We can also think about bagging as a type of smoothing operation, but this relies on assuming something about the underlying distribution of our data. That, again, is not something we can generally verify in practical settings. And then perhaps most closely related to our work, there has been work that explicitly examines stability resulting from bagging. But that pre-existing theory depends on the size of each bag being tiny relative to the total amount of training data, and it assumes that the base algorithm is already stable, and then it just shows that bagging can make it more stable. So it's answering the kind of question that we want to answer, but in only very narrow settings. So to be a little bit more formal, when I talk about stability, what we mean is, what I'm going to use as my definition is the following. So I'm going to say an algorithm A is epsilon delta stable if for any training set D and any test point little x. If I look at the frequency at which this leave one out perturbation is bigger than epsilon, that's going to be less than delta. Okay, so if we go back a couple of slides, I was showing you these histograms, right? So if I were to choose an epsilon of 0.10, I'm counting how often I've got this leave one out perturbation greater than this level epsilon. And for a method to be stable, the frequency over here has to be less than delta. So we're trying to say that there's not too much happening in this region. Only this has to hold for any training data set D, not making any assumptions about what the training set is, if the samples are IID or anything like that, and for any test point X. So I'm not assuming X comes from the same distribution as my training data. Okay, so the main result is the following. Remember, P is the probability of any individual sample I showing up in a bag. So we let A be any base algorithm that returns predictions between 0 and 1, bounded predictions. Then for any N, which is the number of training samples, M, the size of each bag, this bagged algorithm satisfies epsilon delta stability as long as the product delta epsilon squared is sufficiently big. And in particular, as long as it's bigger than 1 over 4 times the number of training samples times P over 1 minus P. So let me just point out a few features of this theorem. So first of all, just to be concrete, right, you could imagine a setting where I've got 10,000 training samples, And every time I form a bag, roughly half the samples are in the bag. And I've got a threshold epsilon, and so I'm going to measure my stability by looking at how often that leave one out perturbation is bigger than 0.01. So this result then tells me that I will have no more than delta frequency 2.5% of the perturbations exceeding that threshold. Notably, this result applies to any bounded base algorithm A. So the original algorithm can be highly unstable. I'm not making any assumptions about the stability of the base method. Could be any wild, crazy neural network you want to imagine. It also holds deterministically for any training set and any test data point. And then we can also make it various extensions. So when I write this a tilde infinity, I'm assuming an infinite number of bags just to keep the notation light. But we can have a finite number of bags, which is super helpful in practice, randomized algorithms A, and even unbounded outputs. Okay, in addition, we can have this theory apply in much broader settings than a lot of the previous analysis. So in particular, I mentioned that past analysis was focused on this setting that I'm calling massive subsampling, where the size of each bag is pretty small relative to the total number of training samples. And so we can directly apply our theory to that setting, and we get a sense of how delta epsilon squared scales with the total number of samples. But our theory also holds in other settings. So we could have proportional subsampling, where, for instance, each bag has, let's say, half of the training samples in it. And this is a common operating regime in practice. Then we would have that delta epsilon squared is bounded below by 1 over n. Or we could have minimal subsampling, and this is particularly relevant in settings like neural networks, where we really want to use as much of the data as possible every time we train the network, and so we want to keep M as big as we possibly can. And there, the stability guarantees are a little bit weaker in terms of what epsilon and deltas are viable in terms of the number of training samples, but we nevertheless do have the ability to get stability guarantees. All right, so let me give you a little bit of intuition about what's happening here. So we've got this collection of n training points, and now let's imagine every possible bag with with m samples. So I've got n choose m different bags. And imagine that I'm making a prediction for each one of them, and my bagged estimate is the ensemble average. So now let's imagine, or let's think about a single sample, xi, yi, and we look at all of the different bags that that sample shows up in. So if we didn't have that sample, we wouldn't have those bags. And so if we looked at the leave one out prediction, we would just be averaging over the bags that didn't contain that ith sample. And so we would get a different predictor using bagging over those remaining bags. And so now what we want to do is we want to figure out how close those two different bagged predictors are. So what we're going to do is imagine that we've got k bad points. So these are points, or training samples, where if we were to leave them out, then the leave one out perturbation is bigger than this threshold epsilon. Okay, and so what we'd like to do is we'd like to get an understanding of how big k can even possibly be, and what are the resulting leave one out perturbations. So the first thing that we do is we look at what I'm calling L1 here, which is the sum of all of the leave one out perturbations, where I'm summing over each sample I might leave out. And this is going to be lower bounded by k, the number of bad points, times epsilon. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an upper bound on L1, and then I'm going to compare the upper and lower bounds, and this is going to result in the theory. So in particular, what we do is we look at how many different bad points are showing up in a typical bag, and we can characterize that. And then that allows us to bound the variation across the bags containing a bad point, giving us an upper bound on L1. And so we combine the upper and lower bounds, and we do some simple algebraic manipulations in order to get the bound on delta and epsilon squared that showed up in our theory. So we're not relying on assumptions about the base algorithm or the distribution of the data, but what we're really relying on here is how many different bad points are even possible given the way that bagging works and what that can imply about the leave one out perturbation sizes. Okay, so empirically, we already talked about looking at those histograms for bagging versus no bagging for different machine learning algorithms. Now what we can do is we can see how our theory is panning out in the context of these different machine learning algorithms. So for instance, in the upper left, what I'm plotting is effectively epsilon versus delta. And so a stable method is going to be below this dashed line, right? The closer we are to the lower left corner in these plots, the smaller that product delta epsilon squared is, then we have delta epsilon stability. So we want to be as far down in this lower left corner as possible. So if we just train a neural network on a collection of training data, we see that we have this red curve here, which is above and less stable than our theoretical stability guarantee in the dashed line. Whereas after bagging, we see this curve below it. So we are seeing that we are satisfying the guarantee provided by our theorem. And the same thing holds when we look at bagged regression trees. And then we also have an example where we're looking at logistic regression. Here we're looking at it in two different settings. In the first setting, the dashed lines correspond to logistic regression in an unstable regime, where the number of training samples is 2 times the dimension. So this is known to be an unstable regime for logistic regression. And we can see that the true regressor is in fact unstable, and then with bagging it becomes stable. In the solid lines, we looked at the exact same algorithm, but we imagined that we were in a stable regime where the number of training samples is 4 times the dimension. This is known to be a stable regime. So the original algorithm is already stable, and after we apply bagging, we have still not exceeded our theoretical bound. So we've maintained the stability of the original method, which is good. We didn't lose anything by using bagging. Okay, so all of this has been just for regression, trying to predict a scalar y. So now what I want to do is move a little bit closer to model selection. And our first step in that journey will be thinking about classification. So in particular, we're going to imagine that we want to predict a class label y, where y can be one of L different labels. So again, we've got a training data set, and we've got a test point x that we're interested in. So now our learning algorithm, I'm going to call it C for a classifier, again, takes in a training data set D and outputs a predictor. But we're going to think about that learning algorithm as being the composition of 2 stages. The first stage, A, is going to take in the training data set and output a vector of weights that's length L. It's going to tell us basically the class posterior probability of each different class. So how likely do I think that a test point has class label 1 versus the likelihood of class label 2 versus likelihood of class label 3, et cetera. And so in particular, you could imagine that this weight vector W hat corresponds to a trained neural network that assigns weights to each class label for a test data point. And in fact, this is exactly how neural network classifiers work. Then we actually want to output a chosen label, so we have a selection step S. And what it does is it selects a class or classes based on the weights. So by far the most common selection method is to say, let me look at all the weights and figure out which one is biggest, and then that's the label I'm going to choose. Okay, so let's look at this in an example with the fashion MNIST data set. So I've got a whole bunch of training samples. There are pictures of clothes and labels. So now I feed this into a learning algorithm A, let's say a neural network, for instance, that outputs weights on each of the different labels for a new test data point. And then I look and see which weight is biggest, and in this case it's the dress, so I would output dress. But now, if I were to remove one training sample and apply my learning algorithm again, then the set of weights for this same test sample could be totally different, and the resulting predicting label would be, again, totally different. So you might say, well, why not just do some bagging? And that is exactly the first thing that we're going to do. We're going to bag this algorithm A that outputs these weight vectors. So we're going to stabilize these vectors of weights using bagging. So if we return to our example now, when we look at these output predicted probabilities, these are going to be nice and stable. And then this selection method, the argmax, is going to choose whichever weight is biggest. In this case, it's the bag. But now if I were to leave out one training sample, what can happen is I'm outputting now a new vector of weights for my test data point. It's stable, like this vector isn't that different from the vector I showed you previously. But now the identity of the label that has the highest weight is different. Now it's the coat instead of the bag. So even though this weight vector is stable, the classification output is still unstable because of this selection step. And so what we need to do is to figure out a way to make a correction here. So our basic approach is to first apply bagging on the algorithm outputting the weights. And then second, we're going to replace that argmax operation with something that's going to help us ensure stability, and this is an inflated argmax. So what it does is it outputs a set of near maximizers of this weight vector and ensures that we're robust to small perturbations. And what we can do by using this approach is show that removal of any training point will result in a collection of selected labels that overlaps with the original collection. So by removing a training data point, we don't get a totally different set of predicted labels. So graphically, what's happening is this. So imagine that my base algorithm outputs a weight vector. And imagine I have 3 classes, so the weight vector is a point in the simplex. And the corners correspond to different labels, where the weight vector is a 1 and the rest are zeros. So for any test data point, I feed it into my algorithm, and I get a particular label, a weight vector. Let's say it's here. So then the argmax is going to say, which vertex of the simplex am I closest to? And in this case, it's the dress. Right? So I've colored different parts of the simplex according to which vertex it's closest to. So the problem is that if I were to have a weight vector here versus a weight vector here, the weight vector has barely perturbed at all, but the argmax operation has resulted in a totally different label. The inflated argmax is working in the same kind of simplex space, but it's using these sort of buffer regions of width epsilon, so that anything in these buffer regions is going to, the selection method is going to output more than one class. So for instance, in that orange region, the output class is going to be coat and shirt. And it's like saying both of those classes have weights that are large but very similar within epsilon of each other. And so I can't reliably or stably choose one or the other, so I'm going to return both. So a little bit more formally, this inflated argmax is going to return a label L when that class L would have had the largest weight if the weights were only slightly perturbed, where both the size of the margin and the amount of weight perturbation scale with epsilon. Okay, so it's deliberately designed to be robust to, or stable relative to these perturbations. Okay, so if now we return to our little toy example, we've got exactly the same set of predicted probabilities as I was showing you before. But now if we use this epsilon inflated argmax, the predicted labels for this test point are bag and coat. Okay, so in particular now, sorry, I just showed too many examples. In the context of classification, we focus on this notion of selection stability, which I described to you a little bit earlier. Well, in a very hand-wavy way, now I'm going to describe it more formally. So we say a classification algorithm with this algorithm A that produces weight vectors and a selection step S that actually selects classes. We say it has selection stability delta if for any training data set and for any test point, we have the following. So I'm going to look at the frequency with which the set of classes output by our method with all the training data versus the set of classes output when I leave out the ith sample. I'm going to look and see how often those two sets have zero intersection, zero overlap. And so I have selection stability delta if the frequency of them having zero overlap is less than delta. So essentially what I'm saying is that my method is stable if most of the time leaving one training sample out gives me at least one class that's the same if I hadn't left a sample out. Right? I haven't totally changed everything about my predicted classes. And so our theorem says that for any base learning algorithm A, a neural network, an SVM, whatever classifier, whatever method you have in mind for outputting this vector of weights for different possible classes, bagging combined with this epsilon inflated argmax is going to have selection stability delta, where delta scales with epsilon, 1 over epsilon squared, 1 over the amount of training data, and this factor p over 1 minus p, where remember p is the probability of any sample showing up in a bag. Okay, so let's look now a little bit less heuristically at this example I've been working through with the fashion MNIST data set. So this data set has 60,000 training samples, and there's 10 different classes, 10 different types of clothing. And the base algorithm that we look at here is 5 epochs of stochastic gradient descent on a simple CNN, right? It's not going to convergence, it's not finding a global minimizer, the hyperparameters are not optimally tuned, right? So I'm not in a regime where my base algorithm is necessarily good. And then what we do is we run sub-bagging. So we have 1,000 different bags, and each bag has half of the training samples in it. And then empirically, to measure how much instability we have, we're going to look at 10,000 test instances, and we are going to look at the set of returned labels where we train on all the training data and the set of returned labels when we train on all but one, and see how often there's just a complete mismatch, or the frequency of a complete mismatch. And that's what we're going to call delta J, and we want that to be as small as possible. So here what I'm plotting is for different instability levels delta, the fraction of test points where the instability is greater than delta. And I'm showing this for 4 different approaches. So in the red dashed line, we have just the standard argmax and the base algorithm. So just our CNN, and then we choose whatever class gets the biggest weight. The standard thing that most of us do when we're learning, say, a classifier. Then, in the blue dashed line, we said, what happens if we just use the inflated argmax, but we stick with the original base algorithm? We don't do any bagging. And we see that that doesn't help our stability almost at all. Then we said, what happens if we use bagging on the base algorithm, say bagged neural network, but we don't use the inflated argmax? And we see it helps, but it's not nearly as good as the combination of bagging and the inflated argmax. So being down here on the lower left is the most stable you can be, and that's exactly where this method is, our method is. Now, there are a couple of ways that I can achieve stability that are stupid, right? One thing I could do to ensure stability is I always tell you it's class 1, right? That's extremely stable, also totally useless. The other thing that I could do is I could just always return all of the classes. I could say, for this test sample, it's either class 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10. Again, extremely stable, but also totally useless. So we need to look at how big the returned set of labels is. And what we see here is that most of the time, we're only returning one label. But when there's uncertainty or ambiguity, we're returning more than one label, so the average is a little bit more than 1. And just with that little increase in the size of the returned set of labels, we're getting a massive improvement in the stability. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you're not sacrificing accuracy in the name of stability. And so there's a lot of colors here. I'll just say that the pale green is our proposed method, and its accuracy is on par with a whole bunch of other methods, so we aren't really sacrificing accuracy by using this strategy. Okay, so finally, I just want to go back to the very beginning and talk about model selection, and this is where my student Melissa really played a key leadership role. So remember that with model selection, we have maybe a family of different models, and we want to choose the one that seems like a good fit, or multiple ones potentially, that are a good fit to our training data set. So similar to what we did in classification, we can write model selection as the composition of two stages. First, a base algorithm that outputs a weight vector W, assigning weights to each possible candidate model. And then second, a selection method that selects a model or models based on those weights. And we want this to be stable. So now that I've written it this way, perhaps you can see that it's extremely similar to the classification setup. And in fact, that's exactly what we're doing. We're treating model selection as an example or an instantiation of classification, where each possible model is a different class. And what we're trying to do is select a model the same way that you would predict a class label. So our approach, perhaps unsurprisingly then, is to take that base algorithm and bag it, and then feed those bagged weights into the inflated argmax. And so all of the stability guarantees we had in the classification setting, we now have in our model selection setting. Okay, so let's look at a concrete example here. So imagine that we are studying an ecosystem in which we're measuring different species abundances. I set this up earlier in terms of microbial communities, but you could also imagine like a couple of species, one's a predator and one's prey. So this has been widely studied for a long time. The Lotka-Volterra system is one way that people model these systems. But what we're going to do is we are going to imagine that we don't actually know the Lotka-Volterra model. All we get to do is we get to observe the abundances of the two different species over time. And what we'd like to do is to estimate governing equations that describe this model. So now what we need is a base algorithm. And what this base algorithm does, remember, is it assigns weights to different candidate models. And so we're going to use Cindy, the sparse regression-based approach that I described way at the very beginning. So remember, the way Cindy works is I'm going to write the derivative of species 1 with respect to t and the derivative of species 2 with respect to t as a weighted sum of the abundances of the species and different polynomials of those abundances. And so what I have to do is I have to estimate the weights, psi, from my observed data. And I think those weights should be sparse. But if I think about this as a linear regression problem, and I look at the empirical correlations between different covariates in the system that I have written up there, what we're seeing is that there are pairs of covariates that are extremely highly correlated, right? So I said at the beginning that this was a concern, and it's not just an abstract concern. Here's an actual system where those correlations manifest. So that means that if I were to try to apply Cindy to this setting, Cindy's going to have a real hard time figuring out whether it should have an equation that's a function of species 2's abundance or species 2's abundance squared, right? And so depending on whether I leave a sample out or not, I might choose an equation with this term, or I might choose an equation with this term. And so this is why we really need stability. And so we apply our method. We do bagging on Cindy, and then we use the inflated argmax. And now we're going to compare it with a bunch of other methods. And we're going to consider 3 different measures of quality. So first, we're going to look at the frequency with which we achieve delta selection stability. So think about these plots as like a CDF. And so you really want your CDF to be up and to the left here. The more stable you are, the more frequently you're achieving delta selection stability, especially for really small delta. Second, we're going to look at utility-weighted accuracy. So we want to make sure that we're not achieving stability just by not just giving totally crappy model selection performance. And so we're basically looking at how often we're selecting the correct model, normalized by how many different models we're returning. And then finally, we're looking explicitly at how many different models are being returned, because if we're achieving stability by just returning 1 million models, we haven't really accomplished much either. Okay, so now what methods are we looking at? In purple, we have our method, where we're using a base algorithm that's been bagged, followed by this inflated argmax. In blue, we have a method we made up, where we take our base algorithm and bag it, and then we just choose the top K models, the K models with the biggest weights. So instead of just choosing the best model, maybe I choose the best 2 models or the best 3 models. And so different points on this plot in blue correspond to different values of K. So this is reasonable sounding. The problem is that a lot of times it's just returning way more models than we need to return, right? Sometimes we're really certain about what model is the right fit, and this is forcing us to return multiple models no matter how certain we are, whereas our method can adapt to that uncertainty. In green, we have stability selection within the equation discovery literature. I think this is equivalent to ensemble SINDI. So basically what they're doing is they're doing bagging of sparse regression, and then they're just counting how often each different covariate appears. So it's a method that's really strongly connected to sparse regression and not to generic model selection methods like ours. We have in yellow just applying the plain old argmax, not using the inflated argmax. And then finally in red, we've got the base algorithm and followed by the argmax. So basically the original SINDI method. And so what we're seeing in these plots is that by using bagging and the inflated argmax, not only do we have theoretically guaranteed stability, but also empirically that bears out. We have high accuracy to go along with it for a wide range of different instability levels. And we have a small number of models returned on average. So with that, I just want to leave you with a couple of open questions. First of all, I've been talking all along about bagging, and it's a great tool in terms of the theory that we've developed. But when you're talking about really large-scale data sets and really complex algorithms, it can be computationally complex to perform bagging. So with this work, we've shown that there exists at least one method, bagging, that guarantees stability. But I think it's an open question of whether there are other methods that could also guarantee stability, perhaps at a lower computational price. Second, we've defined new notions of stability, especially in the context of model selection and classification. And I think another interesting open question is, do these provide new opportunities for understanding generalization outside of regression context? So with that, I would be more than happy to answer any questions, and thank you again for the support from the Simons Foundation. Yeah, Corey.
I had a quick question. So many times in biology, in your fashion example, you have 60,000 data points, but oftentimes in biology, you have very limited data. Can I ever do something from the data directly where I say, I don't have enough information for any algorithm to ever be stable?
So just in case people couldn't hear the question as well, you know, I'm looking at fashion MNIST. I've got 60,000 samples. In biology, I often have a lot less than this. Can I somehow identify settings where no method can be stable? Not to the best of my knowledge. I would say in general, when you have less data, that's where stability is even more of a challenge. And if that data really does not provide any kind of certainty about what the right model is, then these methods would just return all the possible models. So to some extent, when you run this method and you look at the size of the returned set of models, it's giving you, at least heuristically, a sense of how much certainty you have about the possible models that you might want to select. Yeah?
Testing. Okay. Very nice talk. So early on you kind of motivated it with the sparse regression setting where you may pull out different parameter settings from one run to the next. But the theoretical results you presented were always about kind of performance in terms of the output of the network. And so I'm wondering if there are also some theoretical results from you or others about to what extent bagging produces consistent parameter values underlying those outputs.
Right. So yeah, a couple of clarifications. So first of all, I think of our method as a wrapper that can be put around any base model selection method. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a parameter estimation method, which I think you alluded to. And so then, if I understood correctly, you're saying, well, if I do constrain my attention to problems where model selection amounts to parameter estimation, then can I say anything about the stability of those parameters? And I think that this is probably closely related to that stability selection work that I referenced, where they are doing bagging on a sparse regression method, and then they are looking at the coefficient vectors and selecting coefficients that show up after doing regression on lots of different bags. And so I think in that context, you could get stability on coefficient vectors, but it's a little tangential to what I showed here. Yeah. Yes?
I think it's wonderful that you can make this progress on such difficult problems. I just want to point out that there's a long profession of physiology and anatomy which gives up this approach and says we can use biological structure as a tremendous clue to the kind of models that we need. And that's been going on for a long time. And then if you add to that the engineering idea that biology often uses devices in exactly the engineering meaning, you make these kind of problems much, much easier. Now, there are many problems you can't do that way. I'm not trying to say so. But with this kind of general approach, it is also useful to know that we do know an awful lot about biophysics and physiology of things by the approach I just talked about.
So I think this is a great point, but I also do think that it is represented within our framework. So I don't assume anything about that base algorithm. So that base algorithm could be using external side information about physiology, about biophysics, or any other kind of side information
You're
you
way
have.
ahead of me. I don't dare ask you, because I thought it would sound too arrogant. Could you learn to include that? It's obviously better if you had a formalism. But I think that one always has to remember what an anatomy book, histology book, electron microscopy book, and molecular biology book tells you about the importance of structure.
Please use your seat mic.
Yeah, okay, so thank you very much. Yeah, I agree. It is absolutely important to use that information whenever it's available. I 100% agree. And I just want to emphasize, all of the theory I mentioned is a guarantee on the stability, not on the accuracy. And I feel very strongly that in order to get good accuracy, it's extremely important to use all of that knowledge. And so all I can tell you is that it'll be stable, not that it'll be good. Empirically, we're seeing that if you've got a reasonably accurate base method, then we aren't sacrificing accuracy by ensuring stability. And because we do not place big assumptions on our base algorithm, then we have the freedom to incorporate that knowledge however we want.
I didn't understand that.
No, I'm really glad you mentioned it, because I think sometimes we're tempted to say that, oh, I'm going to study a method that amounts to finding the global minimizer of a loss function that's convex or something, and that gives me a lot of mathematical insights. But then it becomes much harder to say, well, what's the effect of incorporating side information in my algorithm, and how does that affect my theory? And so that was one of the reasons why we really wanted this sort of black box framework. But yeah, excellent point. Yeah.
I just have one question. So in your stability framework, you're controlling that you're within epsilon, all the delta fraction of the time. But when you're not within epsilon, those delta times, you don't really have control of how far away you are. And so my question is, are there pathological examples where bagging can send you off to a very bad place when you actually fail to be within epsilon?
Right. So the question, if I understand correctly, and just in case it was hard to hear, is, we've got some fraction of the time that these leave one out perturbations are less than epsilon, and can that still be sort of a negative result or something that could cause, or where bagging could cause us to veer off into bad directions?
Further than epsilon, could it be really bad in those cases? I mean, it could, in your theory.
Oh, when you're greater than epsilon.
Practically, that happens.
Yeah, in practice, it can happen for the base algorithm. The point is that with bagging, right, you've got that one sample that maybe causes you to go, that when you leave it off, it causes your leave one out perturbation to be really enormous. That was what in the theory we consider like a bad point. And the point of, or the way that the theory works is it says that there can only be so many of those bad points, and we bound the number of those bad points, and as a result, they have a limited amount of influence on the bagged predictor.
That I get, but maybe just to sharpen my question, is there theory that says that when you do fail in those limited number of cases, like how bad can it get? How bad can the algorithm get?
So no, or at least we don't have theory that bounds that. Yeah. Interesting thought, though.
So regarding the base algorithm that calculates the probabilities for the modes, just to follow up on the previous questions, if you will include biological information, you might end up with a power law distribution. And in that case, my question is, will the points on the far right then be, computed as bad points and then excluded? Or would the method accommodate for a power law distribution?
So we are not making any assumptions about the distribution of the data. And when I show you those histograms, those are illustrative, but those are settings where we have drawn test data from the same distribution as our training data in a contrived setting. But our theory holds for any test point under the sun. And so we're not constrained to any particular distribution. And notably, our algorithm in no way depends on figuring out which points are bad points and doing anything particular with them. We're just doing bagging. And this notion of these bad points, or these points way out in the tail, is to help understand the sources of instability and help us provide the theoretical guarantees. But algorithmically, we're doing absolutely nothing with them and not making any assumptions about them. Yeah.
Yes, so I had a question about like the setting of stability. How does it relate with, say, the problem of overfitting? Because it seems that these two things must be closely related, right? We're doing model selection exactly not to fit the noise. And second is like, you showed us some examples in which we did bagging and basically we averaged the output, right? Like we built some sort of consensus output by averaging. But what if we had completely different models? Like, can we average the models instead of the output of the models? And how would we go about doing that?
Great. Right. So the first question was, can I think about how overfitting relates to instability? And that's, your intuition is exactly right. And that's what I said far less eloquently when I was on this slide, because really what we're saying is that if you're overfitting, then when you try to look at how you're going to perform on a test point, it could be very different than what you saw in your training samples. And so when we have leave one out errors that are small, or when we have a stable method, those leave one out errors are predictive of the test performance, and therefore it can be an indicator of whether or not we are overfitting. For your second question about whether we could do averaging over models as opposed to bags, empirically, people do this a lot. So for instance, with deep neural networks, what people will do in practice many times is they will train a neural network on all the training data, but each network has a different initialization of the weights. So they try a whole bunch of different random initializations of the weights, train a whole bunch of neural networks in parallel, and then average the results. And so people have found this to be useful in practice, but there are absolutely no theoretical guarantees associated with it. And if you wanted to have theoretical guarantees, then you have to start making assumptions about that model, and you have to start thinking very carefully about the distribution of the different kind of model parameters that you're varying when you form your ensemble. So it's not going to be quite as sort of generic or off the shelf as what I've presented here, even though people do enjoy it in practice quite a bit. Yeah, yes?
ecosystem dynamics, and you have shown how it works for Lotka-Volterra. But sometimes the ecosystem dynamics is not described by ODEs, but rather as a discrete dynamical system. For instance, the same Lotka-Volterra could be a population of foxes and rabbits on year 1 and the next year. Would your theory need to be modified in any way, the Bayesian principles, or it would work kind of off the shelf for those discrete dynamical systems?
Off the shelf, would not need to change it at all. I mean, what you're talking about is having that base algorithm be a different base algorithm. But as I said, we aren't really making any assumptions about that base algorithm. So if you change from a ODE model to a finite differences model, no problem whatsoever. Well, what could be affected is the accuracy, of course. But in terms of the stability guarantees, there'd be no difference.
But I'm a little bit worried that it's sort of, you do some sort of Taylor expansion here, right? You are doing a polynomial fit up to, fifth order, for instance, or fourth order. If you are having a generic function describing the population at the next year as a function of the previous year, it doesn't necessarily well described by the Taylor expansion, right? So
yeah, I think that's fair. So I think, though, what you're critiquing here is that base Cindy algorithm. And we are just using that as an example of a base algorithm that we then stabilize with our techniques. So Cindy itself is not our contribution by any means. But your concerns are well grounded, right? I think there are challenges in practice with using Cindy, which is why there's been many, many papers that have followed the original Cindy paper that are exploring these different challenges and how to mitigate them. Yeah, great point. Yes.
I guess the premise of using like this inflated argmax, I guess to me having like a off-the-shelf this sort of algorithm is very useful for like maybe like you have a robotics application and you have something that has to make decisions in the field, like a self-driving car. But then in this case, it seems like you want the real argmax that gives you one decision and not this uncertainty quantification. On the other hand, if you want uncertainty quantification, like you're doing this model selection, like a graduate student could just look at the histogram, like by eye. So I guess I'm confused, like, why should I use this inflated argmax instead of just looking at all of the information that I get before applying this S?
So I would argue that this W hat that is produced by the base algorithm is representing all of the information. So I could give you just that W hat vector. But if you've got 1 million models, and I give you a vector of length 1 million, I don't know how you use that in a principled way to do science, right? And if you say, well, I just want a student to eyeball it, I guess that also, to me, I would struggle to figure out how to use that in a principled way. So I guess what I would say is that right here with the argmax, I'm only ever returning one model, whichever vertex is as close as possible to the point that I return. We also talked about top K. So let's say top 2 predict selection methods, where I would have a weight vector, and I would say which 2 vertices are closest to this vector. But then I cannot adapt to settings where I'm really certain. Like let's say my weight vector is way over here, so I'm like 99% sure it's model 1, and I'm then going to force myself to return 2 models. That's not a very effective mechanism because it doesn't reflect the fact that I'm pretty sure it's class 1. So the point of the inflated argmax is that whenever it's reasonable, I'm only going to return 1 model. And it's only when these weight vectors that are reflecting all of the data and information that I have available are indicating that I can't reliably choose one and ensure stability, then I'm going to return more than 1. Okay, so I'm just going to take one more question, and then we can all get coffee, perhaps. So, David.
Okay. Wow, I didn't think I was going to conclude. So, letting this warm up. Okay, I'm not sure it's working. Question in the spirit of the last talk's quote, and actually building on what I think there's a theme in the question here. Maybe I'll ask you to speculate potentially. The UQ work here and the work around this uncertainty quantification. It is a wrapper on all models in one respect, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe I'll ask you to speculate. Is there a reason not to always use this?
I'm sorry, so is there
Is there a reason not to? Yeah, should this now be, other than the added computational cost?
That's the
associated?
reason. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. it's
So
the-
yeah, maybe speak to that trade-off a little bit.
Right. I mean, I think there's generally two things to worry about when you think about using this. One is just the additional computational burden, and I think that's a huge priority, is to limit that. And then there's this question of whether the bagging does deplete accuracy. We have no guarantees on accuracy at all. So I showed you one example with fashion MNIST where I showed we are not hurting our accuracy, but there's no guarantee that you won't hurt your accuracy in other settings for other data sets. And so that would have to be handled more on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, a great question. Okay, thank you all so much for the questions.